Colonel James Porter had just left the base after a long day of meetings. His uniform was crisp, his ID tags glinting under the evening sun. He was halfway home when flashing blue lights filled his rearview mirror. A local police cruiser pulled up behind him, sirens blaring. Confused, Porter slowed to a stop on the quiet stretch of road. "Step out of the vehicle," a young officer barked, his tone sharp and impatient. Porter complied calmly, hands visible. "Officer, is there a problem?" But the officer didn't answer. Instead, he advanced quickly, eyes narrowed. "You're resisting orders," the officer suddenly snapped, before firing his taser. The sharp crack of electricity jolted through Porter's body, sending him collapsing to the ground, his uniform dirt-stained. The officer cuffed him without explanation, tossing him into the back of the squad car. Porter's mind raced, not in fear, but in calculation. He knew exactly what was going to happen next, and it wouldn't end well for this police station. From the back of the squad car, Colonel Porter steadied his breathing. His wrists burned from the cuffs, but his voice stayed level. "Officer," he said, his tone controlled but firm, "you've made a serious mistake." The young cop smirked. "Yeah. We'll see about that." At the station, Porter was booked like any ordinary suspect. They took his personal effects, except they didn't notice the small military-issued smartwatch still strapped to his wrist. With a few subtle taps, Porter sent a secure distress signal. Hundreds of miles away, deep in the Pentagon, an encrypted alert pinged on a secure console. Within seconds, a watch officer read the report: Colonel James Porter. Active duty. Detained. No charges specified. The watch officer didn't waste time. "Get the general on the line, now." Within minutes, an emergency response order was authorized. Black SUVs and unmarked armored vehicles began rolling out from a nearby federal facility. The Pentagon wasn't just calling. They were coming. Inside the small-town police station, the atmosphere was casual, officers chatting, paperwork scattered across desks, the faint hum of a coffee machine in the corner. None of them knew what was heading their way. Colonel Porter sat silently in the holding cell, his posture straight, eyes locked on the door. He wasn't angry, just waiting. "Relax, Colonel," one officer chuckled from behind the desk. "No one's coming to rescue you." Porter gave a faint smile. "We'll see." It started with a faint vibration in the floor, barely noticeable. Then, distant rumbles grew louder, like heavy engines approaching in formation. One officer frowned and looked out the window. His jaw dropped. Down the street, a convoy of black SUVs and armored vehicles was advancing, their headlights cutting through the dusk. Men and women in dark tactical gear hung from the sides, radios pressed to their ears. "What the hell is that?" another officer muttered. Porter simply leaned back on the bench. "That," he said calmly, "is your problem." The convoy rolled to a halt in front of the station with military precision. Doors swung open in unison, and a wave of Pentagon security personnel stepped out, their gear spotless, their faces expressionless. At the center of the group, a three-star general strode forward, flanked by two aides carrying sealed folders. His presence alone made the air in the room feel heavier. Inside, the officers scrambled. Chief? We've got company." The station's chief peeked through the blinds, his face draining of color. That's the Department of Defense." Before anyone could react, the front doors burst open. The general didn't waste time on greetings. "Colonel Porter. Where is he?" His voice was deep, calm, but carried the weight of authority no one dared challenge. Two Pentagon operatives stepped forward, bypassing every desk and heading straight for the holding cell. The officers inside the station instinctively stepped back, unsure whether to resist or obey. Porter stood as the cell door swung open. "You took your time," he said with a faint smirk. The general gave a short nod. "Let's go, Colonel. You're done here." As Colonel Porter stepped out of the holding cell, 2 Pentagon operatives flanked him, their movements sharp and deliberate. The station's chief finally found his voice. "Now wait a second, this man assaulted an officer. He's under arrest." The general didn't even look at him. "Chief, I strongly suggest you stop talking before you make this any worse for yourself." One of the Pentagon aides placed a sealed folder on the chief's desk and flipped it open just enough for him to see. His eyes widened as he scanned the classified clearance codes and the signatures of people far above his pay grade. "This is, national level?" the chief stammered. "It's far above your jurisdiction," the general said flatly. "In fact, your officer's conduct tonight will be the subject of a federal investigation. I trust you understand the gravity of that." The young cop who had used the taser shifted nervously, suddenly pale. It was just procedure. Porter's voice cut like steel. "You incapacitated a decorated officer of the United States Army without cause. That's not procedure. That's reckless." The general's gaze swept the room, pausing on each officer. "This station will fully cooperate with our Internal Affairs Division. And until then, stay out of our way." The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like the whole building was holding its breath. Without another word, Pentagon operatives began moving through the building like a silent storm. 2 headed for the evidence room, others positioned themselves at every exit. Their presence made it clear, this was no negotiation. The station's phones began ringing off the hook. Local reporters had already caught wind of the convoy's arrival, and a crowd was forming outside. Flashbulbs from camera crews lit the night as shouts echoed from the sidewalk. Inside, the general gave a curt order: secure all footage from tonight, every body cam, dash cam, and security feed. Nothing leaves this building without Pentagon authorization. A pair of operatives immediately plugged into the station's servers, copying files with precision. The local IT officer tried to protest, but one look from the general froze him in place. Meanwhile, Colonel Porter stood by the door, watching as the very men who had mocked him minutes earlier now avoided his eyes. The young officer who had fired the taser sat at his desk, hands trembling, realizing just how far this had escalated. When the data sweep was complete, the general turned to Porter. "You're free to go, Colonel. But I'll be in touch. This isn't over." Porter gave a slow nod. "I know." By the next morning, the incident had exploded across national news. Grainy cell phone footage of the Pentagon convoy arriving at the small-town station was plastered on every major network. Headlines screamed, "Army Colonel tasered without cause, Pentagon responds within hours." In the station, morale had plummeted. The chief was on the phone with state officials, trying, and failing, to contain the damage. The young officer who had used the taser was placed on immediate suspension pending federal review. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, an emergency meeting was held behind closed doors. The general briefed top defense officials, laying out the body cam footage, the arrest logs, and the lack of any legal justification for the stop. "This wasn't just a breach of protocol," he said. "It was an attack on one of our own." On social media, veterans and active duty personnel voiced their outrage, demanding accountability. Hashtags calling for justice for Colonel Porter began trending worldwide. Porter himself remained quiet, staying off the record. But those who knew him understood, when he finally spoke, it would be on his terms, and it would carry weight. The question now wasn't if the police department would face consequences. It was how severe they would be. 2 days later, Colonel Porter stood behind a podium at a packed press conference. Cameras clicked, microphones crowded the stand, and the room buzzed with anticipation. He began with calm, deliberate words. "I've served this country for over 20 years, both here and abroad. I've faced situations far more dangerous than a traffic stop, but never have I been treated with such disregard for my rights, my service, and my safety." Reporters scribbled furiously. The colonel's voice didn't waver, but there was a steel edge beneath it. "What happened to me could happen to any citizen," he continued. I wasn't targeted because of a uniform. I was targeted because someone in a position of authority acted without discipline, without respect, and without accountability. He paused, scanning the room. I believe in the rule of law. And I believe those who enforce it must be held to the highest standard. That is why I am fully cooperating with the Pentagon's investigation, and I expect full transparency from this police department. The general, standing just off to the side, gave the faintest nod of approval. By the time Porter stepped away from the podium, his words were already making headlines. The public pressure was now a tidal wave, and the small-town department was directly in its path. Within hours of Colonel Porter's press conference, the Pentagon's investigative team returned to the small-town police station, this time with federal warrants. Agents in dark suits moved methodically through every office, collecting documents, pulling hard drives, and tagging evidence. The hum of printers and the click of evidence bags filled the air as officers watched in uneasy silence. The young cop who had fired the taser sat alone in the break room, staring at the table. A senior federal investigator entered, set down a recorder, and said simply, "We need to talk." Outside, news vans lined the street. Reporters interviewed locals who expressed shock and embarrassment that their town had become the center of a national scandal. Inside the Pentagon, every new piece of evidence was reviewed in real time. The general overseeing the case made it clear, this was no longer just about one bad stop, it was about systemic failure. The station's chief received a summons to appear before a federal oversight panel within the week. His hands shook as he read the document, knowing his career was hanging by a thread. And through it all, Colonel Porter stayed silent, letting the system work, but always ready to step back into the spotlight if the truth was threatened. The hearing room in Washington, D.C., was packed, journalists in the back, military officers in uniform along the sides, and a row of stern-faced lawmakers seated at the front. The air felt heavy with expectation. The police chief took his seat at the witness table, flanked by legal counsel. Across from him sat the oversight panel, their expressions unreadable. Cameras rolled as the chairperson began. "Chief, you are here to answer for the unlawful detention and use of force against Colonel James Porter. You will answer every question truthfully and completely. Do you understand?" The chief cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am." The questioning began, methodical and relentless. Footage from the body cams was played on large monitors for all to see, Porter complying, the sudden taser strike, the lack of any lawful explanation. The room fell silent as the final clip ended. One lawmaker leaned forward. "Chief, can you explain how this is procedure in your department?" The chief's voice faltered. It shouldn't have happened." Colonel Porter, seated in the gallery, kept his expression neutral. The general, sitting beside him, didn't blink. By the end of the day, the panel announced that disciplinary measures would be immediate and far-reaching. The young officer who had used the taser would face criminal charges. The department would be placed under federal oversight pending reforms. The message was clear, this was no slap on the wrist, the hearing's outcome sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. News outlets broadcast the ruling live, replaying the body cam footage alongside the panel's decision. Within 24 hours, the young officer was formally charged with excessive use of force and unlawful detention. His badge and weapon were confiscated on the spot. The police chief announced his early retirement, though most knew it wasn't voluntary. The department's vehicles now bore new federal seals, signaling direct Pentagon oversight. Training manuals were pulled, rewritten, and reissued. Officers were informed that every action from this point forward would be reviewed by a federal liaison. Colonel Porter kept a low profile, returning quietly to his duties at the base. Yet everywhere he went, service members and civilians alike stopped to shake his hand, thanking him for standing his ground. In the town itself, opinions were split. Some saw the Pentagon's intervention as necessary justice, others viewed it as federal overreach. But no one could deny, the department would never operate the same way again. For Porter, the ordeal had become more than a personal injustice. It was a reminder of the weight of accountability, and the cost of letting power go unchecked. Weeks later, Colonel Porter sat in his modest home office, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the desk. A thick envelope had just arrived from the Pentagon. Inside was the official closure report on the incident. He read each page carefully. The findings were conclusive, the officers' actions were unjustified, the department's oversight was inadequate, and federal supervision would remain in place for at least 2 years. At the back of the report was a short, handwritten note from the general: "You stood your ground with dignity." That made all the difference. Porter leaned back in his chair, reflecting. This wasn't about revenge. It had never been. It was about ensuring that what happened to him wouldn't happen to another soldier, another citizen, or anyone who believed in the rule of law. Later that evening, he addressed a small gathering at the base. "We serve to protect freedoms, both abroad and at home," he said. "And sometimes, that means defending them here, when those entrusted with authority forget what it stands for." The room erupted in applause. Porter gave a small nod, then stepped down from the podium. Outside, the night was calm. The crisis had passed, but its impact would ripple for years. And somewhere in that small-town police station, the empty cell where Porter once sat stood as a silent reminder, one that no one would forget.